Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to give it another minute and then we'll go ahead and get started. So thank you for waiting. Okay, so it's now 2 p.m. Eastern, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So hi, everyone, and on behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, welcome to our webinar today on risk management for small water and wastewater systems. My name is Avery Davis from the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. Before we begin, I'm going to cover a few housekeeping items and then we can get started. During the training today, everyone will be kept on mute to ensure audio quality. If you have a question, please type it into the GoToWebinar question dialog box anytime throughout the session. We will be saving your questions for a facilitated Q&A session at the end of the presentation. After the webinar, you will receive a follow-up email that includes a link to the recording and other information you may need. You can also download the slides from today in the Handouts tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. This session has not been submitted for pre-approval of continuing education credits, but eligible attendees will receive a certificate of attendance for their personal record. To receive a certificate, you must attend for the entire duration of the webinar, register and attend individually using your real name and unique email address. Certificates will be sent via email within 30 days of the webinar date, and you can use this document to self-submit for credit, but we cannot guarantee it'll meet your PDH or CDU requirements. If you have any questions or need assistance, please contact us at smallsystems@syr.edu. Now for a little bit about the Environmental Finance Center Network. We provide training and technical assistance to small public water systems in all U.S. states and territories to help local water systems achieve their goals and stay in compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act. If your community or utility needs assistance with drinking water system management, please feel free to contact us through our request form, which I will be sharing shortly in the chat. And on that note, I would like to introduce our speaker for today. So we have Barish Salman, an assistant professor of civil engineering in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Syracuse University. So Barish, I'm going to make you a presenter and then we can go ahead and get started.
All right. Just a quick audio video check. Everybody can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you okay. You were just sharing your slides, but they are no longer on the screen.
Oh, they are not? Okay, sorry. So let me try again.
Yep, now we can see them.
All right, great. Sorry about that. All right, thank you, Avery, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are located. Thank you for joining us in today's webinar. As Avery mentioned, I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Syracuse University. And in my research, I focus on infrastructure asset management. In today's session, we will focus on risk management approaches for small water and wastewater systems. I should, however, note the contents of this presentation can also easily be applied to other systems as well. So I'd like to start with some background information on water and wastewater systems in the United States. As many of you may already know, ASCE issues a report card every 4 years to evaluate the status of a nation's infrastructure systems. In its latest report card, ASCE indicated that there are more than 140,000 active drinking water systems in the US, and more than 90% of these systems serve populations of less than 10,000 people. This number is important because EPA considers water systems serving less than 10,000 persons as small public water systems. In fact, EPA indicates that 60% of these systems serve 500 persons or fewer. The nation's water network consists of 2.2 million miles of underground pipes. Unfortunately, for many areas, the water network is in a bad state. On average, a water main break occurs every 2 minutes, and as a result, the ASCE graded the US water network with a grade of C-. I should note, however, this implies a minor improvement, as historically speaking, the report card graded the water network with a D- in the 2000s and with a D in 2010s. So according to EPA's 2015 needs survey, more than $470 billion was needed to address the needs in several areas over a 20-year period. This figure roughly translates to $600 billion in today's dollars, if we do a conversion based on ENR's construction cost index values. Transmission and distribution accounted for a large chunk of these needs, as shown in the graph taken from EPA's report. When it comes to wastewater systems, again, I'm using ASCE's report card to provide some background information. According to the 2021 report card, there are more than 16,000 water treatment plants in the US, which collectively treat more than 60 billion gallons of wastewater a day. 15% of these systems reached or exceeded their design capacity. 20% of the population relies on septic tanks, whereas the central systems take advantage of more than 800,000 miles of sewer pipes, along with 50,000 miles of lateral connections. Actually, 500,000, sorry about that. According to EPA's definition, small publicly owned wastewater systems correspond to systems that handle flows of less than 1 million gallons per day. The overall grade reported in the latest report card is a D+. Again, there seems to be a minor improvement in grades assigned to wastewater systems over the years, as in 2000s, the grade assigned was a D-, which then gradually improved to D and then to D+ since then. According to EPA's 2012 needs survey, $270 billion was needed in 2012 over the next 20 years to address the needs in wastewater systems. Again, using the ENR construction cost index, this number is roughly equal to $370 billion in today's dollars. According to the results provided, a large portion of these needs corresponded to needs related to conveyance systems, wastewater treatment systems, and combined sewer overflow correction. Coming back to the ASC report card one last time, it can be seen that there's a considerable gap in terms of funding needs and available funding for water, wastewater, and stormwater systems for a period of 10 years. So this table is for a 10-year period instead of the 20-year period. So managing water and wastewater systems is getting more and more difficult. Some of the challenges associated with managing water and wastewater systems are listed on the slide. Lack of funding has been an ongoing issue for various infrastructure systems. Same can be said for the aging infrastructure. Infrastructure systems are built in a piecemeal fashion in many areas, resulting in different standards, materials, and practices to be used. This variation, along with different environmental conditions that are in play for systems located in different places, make it difficult to generalize observations made in one case to others. Climate change is causing extreme weather events to be observed in many areas, resulting in operational challenges when it comes to managing stormwater. Many utilities are struggling with loss and shortage of skilled personnel and managers. Also, testing and adoption of new technologies can be slow due to risks involved in with deviating from tried and true procedures. And this list can be expanded to include other challenges as well. So we all know our utilities and government agencies are struggling with overcoming these challenges with the limited resources that are available at their disposal. So how can we solve these issues? Asset management offers a solution to address these challenges in the most efficient way. And the definition of asset management is provided here on this slide. According to EPA, it's the practice of managing infrastructure capital assets to minimize the total cost of owning and operating them while delivering the service level customers desire. So you might be wondering what's new about this. You might be saying to yourself, I've been managing assets my whole life. So what's new? Well, the truth is managing assets is a big part of asset management. However, asset management covers a broader list of activities, focusing on the strategic goals of an agency. Focusing on the short-term needs of assets and managing them may better be thought of as a tactical goal. While achieving tactical goals is necessary to achieve long-term strategic objectives, it may simply not be enough when long-term objectives are considered. So in asset management, more emphasis is placed on strategic goals, long-term relationships, triple bottom line and value, lifecycle management, and business risks. So one of the most important aspects of adopting an asset management approach is to take on a holistic lifecycle-based approach when making decisions. This lifecycle-based approach needs to extend to the whole network to maximize the efficiency in how we use our resources. The major lifecycle stages of an asset include planning, design, initial construction, evaluation, and operation and maintenance. O&M period, operation and maintenance period, also includes more extensive repair activities. And if the asset needs to be reconstructed or replaced, a new cycle starts with the planning of this reconstruction or replacement project. With this general introduction to asset management, now let's shift our focus to risk management and discuss how risk management fits into the overall asset management strategy. So literature on risk management is rich. However, at this point, I'd like to borrow some key definitions from the transportation sector. So 23 CFR 515 is the specific code of federal regulations, which defines how state DOTs, state departments of transportation, must develop their asset management plans as required by the relevant US code, USC 119. The reason why I'm turning to the transportation sector here is due to the large body of research present on payment and bridge management areas, and also due to the recent regulations that required state DOTs to generate a risk-based asset management plan for the national highway system. So according to this code, risk is defined as positive or negative effects of uncertainty or variability upon agency objectives. And risk management is defined as process and framework for managing potential risks, including identifying, analyzing, evaluating, and addressing the risks to assets and system performance. In the following sections, we'll discuss some of the important parts of these two definitions. So the definition of risk brings to mind Winston Churchill's famous quote: the pessimist sees difficulty in every opportunity. The optimist sees the opportunity in every difficulty. While this quote deals with personal perspectives more than actual risks, it's an important quote which highlights that it might be possible to turn some risk events into opportunities with the right attitude. I guess we can add to this quote by indicating what a risk manager sees. The risk manager identifies and manages both positive and negative impacts in every risk event. Apart from positive and negative effects, the CFR definition that we just looked at, it also focuses on uncertainty and variability. Although both of these phenomena can increase risk, they differ in their definitions. Uncertainty originates from a lack of data or an incomplete understanding of the risk assessment context of the risk assessment decision. In an asset management context, this is highly relevant because in many cases, we don't exactly know how assets deteriorate, and none of us can predict perfectly how factors outside of our control may change in time. When it comes to variability, variability originates from the inherent heterogeneity or diversity of data in an assessment. In the asset management context, variability would relate to all the things that make our assets unique, like location, time of construction, variations in applicable design and construction practices, and differences between different parts of the same asset. As you might imagine, many of these sources of variability also increase the uncertainty in estimating deterioration mechanisms. So given the varying sources and magnitudes of risk, which may jeopardize our success in achieving our objectives, we need a systematic approach to managing risks. A formal risk management approach mainly consists of 4 steps: identification of risks, risk assessment, risk mitigation, and monitoring risks. In this presentation, we'll go over each one of those steps in detail. So let's start with identification of risks. So risks can originate from 2 major sources, internal or external. As the name implies, internal risks mainly correspond to events that fall within the control of the agency. Examples of internal risks may include not being able to optimize resources and agency efforts due to organizational issues, siloed decision-making procedures, changing any aspects of asset management efforts, like adapting new inspection procedures, prediction models, decision support systems, or adopting a new strategic vision for the agency. So as you might imagine, while some of these events can be considered risky because they might result in negative impacts, some of them also may present opportunities to improve upon existing operating procedures. External risks originate from sources outside of the agency. Examples of these risks include, or may include, availability of funding, political, social, technological trends, weather events, natural and human-caused disasters, changes in regulations, and so on. Even though the source is outside, sources of these risks are outside of the control of the agency, an agency can still take precautionary steps to lower the impacts of such risk events on their end goals. Risks can also be identified at different levels, such as strategic risks, tactical risks, and operational risks. Strategic risks are at the very top of the hierarchy. These risks may impact an agency's ability to achieve its long-term objectives. These risks can also have a cascading impact on the lower level objectives as well. Generally, managing these strategic risks fall under the responsibility of top-level managers or decision makers in an agency. Tactical risks correspond to risk events that may affect an agency's performance in achieving more specific objectives that are expected to be achieved in a relatively shorter time frame when we compare it against strategic risks. These objectives may relate to preserving, maintaining, or improving condition of the network through CIP, like capital improvement plans or O&M plans, or improving performance in terms of customer relations. Generating and implementing plans for improving databases or data collection procedures can also be considered examples of tactical objectives. When it comes to lower level, we have operational risks. These risks correspond to risks encountered during actual execution of projects, like maintenance, repair, reconstruction activities. These are short-term in nature, and good number of risks managed at this level may relate to managing the schedule and or cost of a project. So we have a wide range of different levels of risks, different sources of risks. So it is very important to generate a comprehensive list of risks that may originate from these different sources and from different levels. Diverse group of decision makers and stakeholders need to join forces and identify these risks to generate a comprehensive list. Many agencies find a workshop environment useful in facilitating these discussions. Some of the questions decision makers should focus on include some of the questions listed on this slide. What are the risks to achieving organization's objectives? What is the source of each risk? When, where, why, and how can these risk events occur? What are the potential outcomes and how severe are they? Who might suffer from these risk events? What controls, precautions, redundancies exist in the system? Best practices in risk management highlight that the risk identification step should result in detailed if-then statements rather than just short, vague summaries of risks. Two examples I put on this slide include, if we don't replace our chlorinator this year, then we may not be able to provide safe drinking water to our customers. Another one, if our inventory is not accurate, then it reduces our ability to manage our assets effectively. So we had 4 steps, and now once we identify our risks, then comes the step of assessing these risks. So this step involves assigning a risk score to identified risks using likelihood and potential impacts of these risk events. A risk matrix, as shown on this slide, can be a useful tool to facilitate this evaluation. It should be noted that the scales used for these variables, like the likelihood, impact, or consequence, and risk, need to be defined carefully. In this example, likelihood is expressed as a percentage. The consequence is expressed as an index value on a scale of 0 to 100, and risk is expressed on a very low to very high scale. So different combinations of likelihood and consequence gives you different levels of risk, essentially. So in predicting the likelihood of an risk event, we generally think of past observations or past occurrences. So keeping a record of issues addressed is always a good practice. If we don't have a reliable database for past observations, then we may look into experiences of other utilities or maybe researchers by reviewing the available literature on the subject. And lastly, we can also support the available information by consulting manufacturers' specifications. Consequences or impacts of a risk is difficult to express in monetary terms. And if the objective is to just prioritize risks, then index values can be useful. In any case, decision makers should pay attention to subjectivity and potential for bias when determining these impacts of risk events. And it is advisable for decision makers to compare their resultant overall risk values with their risk tolerance. So what we mean here is that the key questions to be asked here are, what risk events are not tolerable, therefore need immediate attention or action? And what risk events are very unlikely to happen, or if they do happen, their potential impacts will be really low? So the answers to these questions can be used to verify the initial risk values assigned to these different risk events. So as I mentioned before, asset management is different from managing assets, but managing assets make up a big portion of the effort spent in asset management. When it comes to managing assets, eliminating premature or unexpected failures is a key objective simply due to cost differential in planned versus emergency repair contracts. So eliminating cascading impacts on other systems can also be a huge advantage when we compare proactive and preventive asset management practices to more reactive approaches. So when an asset fails, that means it fails to fulfill its intended function in a cost-effective manner. So when you define asset failure in this way, you can quickly notice that assets may fail in different ways or different modes. Two primary modes of failure are structural or physical failure due to wear and tear or deterioration, and functional failure due to assets' inability to provide the required or desired level of service or capacity. A third mode may be economic failure, in which maintenance and repair costs for an asset make repairing these assets or maintaining them not feasible anymore. When we consider an asset's failure as a risk event, we need to be more specific as to what kind of failure we are referring to, because the likelihood and consequence values will most likely differ depending on the failure mechanism. But again, it's a function of probability of failure and consequence of failure. So when we look into probability of failure, if we plot it against time, what we end up with is usually a bathtub curve, like the one shown on this slide. So the probability value starts from a initially high value, it drops considerably, and then rises again with the passage of time. The high starting point is due to potential issues with design and construction related practices. So if it's constructed or manufactured correctly, then we would expect to see a low starting point, a low probability of failure in the initial stages. And then we expect this value to rise gradually with the passage of time. But of course, due to the uncertainty and variability in our data sets, like the ones we discussed in the earlier stages of this presentation, the probability of failure value cannot be determined with 100% certainty. So analyzing past observations is a good starting point to build prediction models for probability of failure. By analyzing mean time between failures, probability functions can be fitted. Another possibility is to use statistical approaches to identify significant variables that affect the variable of interest. If detailed data is not available, but we have personnel with strong memories, we can rely on their expert opinion to generate probability of failure values. And if none of these sources are available, or if we end up with results that are not very meaningful, we can collect data from the industry or manufacturers. When it comes to consequences of failure, following a triple bottom line approach is valuable. So considering economic, environmental, and social impacts together will produce more comprehensive consequence values. Important factors in these three categories may overlap. That's why I have this Venn diagram with three sets with some overlaps with each other. As an example, a collapsed wastewater pipe may result in discharge of raw sewage to the environment, which could lead to fines or penalties. So we will have both environmental and economic impacts occurring as a result of raw sewer discharge. So looking into these three categories in more detail will allow us to identify points of overlap and divergence. In terms of economic impacts, we are generally concerned with the immediate monetary impacts, which may come in the form of reconstruction or replacement cost, or penalties and fines. Failure in one asset may also result in failure of an adjacent system, like pipe failures resulting in sinkholes of the pavement. So we may need to consider such secondary impacts as well. In terms of social impacts, we are concerned with negative impacts immediately impacting users of the system. These may come in the form of user costs, inconvenience due to disruptions in service, or health issues due to contamination. And environmental impacts deal with direct impacts on to the environment. Examples will include contamination or pollution, energy wasted in removing these contaminants or in remedying a situation, higher levels of emission that may occur as a result of longer detours or higher levels of congestion on roadways when we have pipe failures, which usually share a corridor, like they are usually located right underneath streets or pavements. So again, failure in the pipe system may result in environmental impacts because of drivers, having to make longer detours. All right, so when we do our risk assessment, when we complete this step, then comes decision making on how we address these risks. So this step is called risk mitigation. In risk mitigation, we can divide our potential actions into 5 categories. Treating a risk requires lowering the likelihood and or impact of a risk event, because these two make up what we consider the risk in the first place. Terminating can be considered as an extreme form of treating a risk in which the risk event is completely eliminated. So examples for treating a risk may include rehabilitating an infrastructure asset, whereas terminating may include changing the system in such a way that the asset is no longer needed and it's just taken out of service. Transferring the risk involves passing the risk onto another party. Classic example from our everyday life is just buying insurance, right? By purchasing insurance, we are passing the risk of expenditures onto a third party. Tolerating the risk means accepting the risk and not taking any immediate corrective action to lower the risk. And lastly, taking advantage of a risk focuses on moving forward with a risky decision due to the potential opportunities that can be captured with such a move. When faced with difficult and risky situations, we may find innovative and out-of-the-ordinary solutions that may be beneficial in lowering risks in other risk events. So in general, the top risks with a combination of high likelihood of occurring and high impact or consequence need to be treated or terminated through interventions. Whereas generally lower level risks can be tolerated. And for risks that fall into the middle, a mix of these 5 approaches can be appropriate. So in civil infrastructure management, when we treat risks, we generally look for ways of lowering the probability of a risk event to occur, because it may be harder to lower the consequences of failure, because usually these depend on the location of the asset, which may not be easy to change. So when it comes to managing assets and lowering the probability of failure, we have several options. In preventive maintenance, our objective is to delay the failure of an asset. In routine maintenance, as the name implies, the objective is or what we do here is a maintenance activity that is done based on a certain predetermined frequency. In hard time replacement, we replace an asset or component after a set time, regardless of its condition, or we don't really care how well it's performing. We just replace it after a set time. In repair, we focus on fixing localized problems. Rehabilitation provides the asset with a better condition state, and reconstruction typically involves demolition of the old structure or asset and construction of a new one in its place. So while choosing between these alternatives, we need to consider the whole life cycle of the asset. And we need to consider benefits and costs from a triple bottom line perspective. And once we identify risks and assess them, and once we determine a right, ideal course of action for mitigation, it's always good practice to summarize this process in a tabular format. The resultant output of this effort will be called a risk register. The risk register typically involves information on source of risk, type of risk, that should be type of risk, likelihood, potential impacts, risk score, mitigation strategy, and the anticipated risk score if the mitigation strategy is successful. And this brings us to our last step, which is monitoring risks. The last step is important because risk register should be a living document, which gets updated on a periodic basis. Information on actual occurrences and actual impacts observed should be incorporated into newer versions. And as an agency matures in its asset management practices, it may decide adopting new data collection or analysis methods, and this may result in newer ways of assessing risk. And as a result, in the monitoring stage, the objective is to repeat the previous steps of identifying, assessing, and planning risk mitigation efforts on a periodic basis. So far, the discussion we had has been focusing on risks that can be identified through a workshop or a group process. But what about unknown unknowns? This means risk events that may happen in the future, but we don't know what these risk events are at the moment. So in a relatively new publication on the subject, the term black swan was used to define extremely rare events that may have massive impacts, most of the times negative impacts, and can be rationalized in hindsight. So our limitations in predicting future events based on past events is apparent in the black swan example. If someone from outside of Australasia is asked, they can easily say all swans are white due to their past experience. But they will be really surprised by seeing black swans after they travel to Australasia. So we might be limited in predicting future events if we solely depend on our observations on past events. But how can we manage risks from unknown unknowns? We can list a few preventive strategies, including scenario planning, improving the resilience of our systems, and a corrective strategy that focuses on minimizing the impacts of a risk event through generating effective crisis management strategies. Among these three strategies, improving resilience deserves special attention. So there are 4 properties of resilience, which include robustness, rapidity, redundancy, and resourcefulness. Robustness deals with limiting the extent of damages. Rapidity deals with quickly returning to a fully functional state. Redundancy deals with having the opportunity to introduce additional components to take over the tasks that were initially handled by the damaged asset. And lastly, resourcefulness deals with having the necessary resources and means to handle the crisis before it generates any cascading impacts on other systems. So improving these four properties may better prepare us for unknown risks. I also would like to highlight the importance of adapting a risk management approach for the whole life cycle of assets. Seeing risk management as a process limited to managing risks associated with operation and maintenance of existing assets will result in inefficient use of resources. And that is simply because the planning and design phases have the highest impact on the performance of an asset throughout its life cycle. This can be explained by a conceptual figure like this one. So here I'm trying to show the influence of our decisions on the whole life cycle performance of an asset with respect to different life cycle stages. And the cumulative expenditure is also provided in the figure. So this is purely conceptual. It's not coming from an actual study. But when we walk through it, I think it will make sense. So the blue curve gives the potential influence of decisions made throughout the life cycle of an asset in different life cycle stages. And the orange line describes the cumulative expenditure throughout the life cycle of an asset. So the asset spends most of its life in the operation and maintenance phase, but the influence of our decisions at this stage is very limited because the important characteristics of the asset are already locked in during the decisions we made in the previous stages. In contrast, planning, design, and construction phases are usually short phases, but the level of influence for decisions made at these stages, particularly in the very early stages, have the highest potential for a positive impact. So to summarize, if we would like to be more effective in managing risks, we need to minimize risks that may arise as a result of decisions we make in the initial stages of a new asset or an asset that will go under a reconstruction process, as well as minimize risks associated with existing assets, like managing the risk of failure. And in the last part of this presentation, I'd like to revisit EPA's 5 core components for asset management. And I would like to discuss how risk management relates to these components. 5 core components involve determining the current state of our assets, identifying minimum and desired levels of service, identifying assets that are critical to providing these levels of service, identifying solutions that will result in minimum life cycle costs, and generating a long-term funding plan. So the first component focuses on determining the current state of our assets. So this involves generating an asset inventory, mapping the locations of our assets, assessing our assets' conditions, and determining the remaining useful lives of our assets. Some of the potential risks involved with these tasks are missing a major asset, oversimplifying or overdoing this process, mistakes in recorded data, inconsistent inspection procedures, and remaining useful life, determining a remaining useful life that does not really represent the actual value. So talking about some of these potential risks, assets in network systems are recorded in hierarchical structures with parent-child relationships. So the key question will be, at what point do we stop? So what point do we assign a unique asset ID number? So the answer usually lies at what level we perform our maintenance activities. So parts that are replaced, simply replaced, are usually considered components, not assets. So recording these as assets will be overdoing the process. So assets may consist of multiple components. To treat these risks, the ones that you see on the slide, we may need to invest in generating standardized business rules for record keeping, inventorying, and condition assessment procedures, along with maybe investing in some training programs. The second component is identifying the required and desired minimum levels of service. This step also inherently requires matching the demand placed on our systems with the capacity our systems can provide. Some of the risks involved with this procedure, again, identifying level of service, may involve changing regulations and customer characteristics. If regulations get stricter and or demand placed on our system gets larger, and if we fail to acknowledge these changes in a timely manner, we may be faced with the risk of failing to identify the necessary levels of service in a timely manner. So to treat these risks, we may need to monitor closely the changing landscape in terms of required and desired levels of service expected from our agency or utility. The third step involves identifying critical assets for us to be able to sustain the level of service offered by our assets at the minimum possible cost. To be able to accomplish this, we need to determine failure mechanisms for our assets. Again, this can be functional or structural, and determine the probability and consequence of failure values for these mechanisms. And lastly, we need to assess risk of failure by combining these two metrics, probability and consequence of failure values. So potential risks for this step include missing major failure mechanisms and mistakes in the risk assessment process in the form of assigning unrealistic values for probability and consequence of failure. Again, to treat these risks, we may need to invest in documenting failures as soon as they occur. So we have a good database of past observations, right, or past occurrences. And we may want to invest some time and effort in validating the probability, consequence, and risk values that we get as a result of our risk assessment procedure with manufacturers or other personnel from the same agency or utility. Fourth step involves generating action plans that result in minimum lifecycle costs. And this requires comparison of initial costs and future maintenance, repair, and reconstruction costs between different alternatives. Potential risks here may include mistakes in cost estimates for initial and future cost items, failing to recognize the changing value of money with respect to time, comparing alternative scenarios on an unequal basis, and failing to take into account potential future work on adjacent infrastructure. So if you want to talk a little bit more about these risks, when alternative scenarios are considered, it is important to pay attention to discounting future expenditures. Also, alternatives that require larger initial investments typically provide longer service lives. So not accounting for that may result in unfair comparisons between alternative scenarios. And lastly, as majority of water and wastewater pipes are buried under local street networks, there may be opportunities to optimize expenditures by maybe timing projects on the transportation and pipe network in a coordinated manner. So to treat these risks, it is important to invest in good record-keeping procedures to determine costs of similar projects from the past, and also maybe to invest in opening new communication channels with personnel responsible for managing different systems, different infrastructure networks. And the last step focuses on generating a long-term budget that accounts for sources of funding and expenditures. Potential risks involved with this step include missing key sources of income or expenditures, not generating a dedicated reserve for future expenditures, and not exhausting all possible sources of funding. To treat these risks, it is important to adopt a proactive approach to securing funds for future expenditures by determining approximately how much money will be needed on a yearly basis, so that sufficient money will be saved or collected to cover these expenditures. So of course, it's much more difficult to secure funding for immediate needs. So if we can plan for future expenditures using a proactive approach, this may prove to be a more efficient approach. While securing funding is always a pressing issue, establishing ties with relevant state and federal agencies and documenting needs in a timely manner, being proactive, may increase a utility's chances when it comes to securing funding. So this concludes my presentation. I think we have about 10 minutes or so left, so I'll be happy to answer any questions the audience might have. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation. It looks like we only have one question in at the moment, so I do encourage our audience, if you have any questions, please enter those into the questions box in your control panel. So for the one question, referring to the bathtub curve you showed, they asked why the probability of failure starts at the highest point.
Yes, so that's a great question. Again, this is a conceptual curve. It's not taken from any real study, but the reason why we might have high probability of failure at the initial stages is mostly related to issues with initial construction or manufacturing process. It depends on the asset. For many of the civil assets like pipes and so on, usually we start with a low probability of failure rather than high, especially if the construction, workmanship quality is high. So we don't expect to see a lot of problems initially. But with other types of assets, more mechanical in nature, we might have some issues with the way they were produced or manufactured. Sometimes transportation might cause some problems with the quality of the product we receive, right, when it's installed. So that might result in maybe a high probability of observing problems at the initial stages. But that's a good observation. So, usually in civil assets, mostly we start with lower probability and then it gradually increases with time to fail.
Great, thank you so much for answering that.
Sure.
It looks like there are no more questions at this time, so we're gonna maybe wait a couple minutes, see if any more roll in. So while we wait for those, I do want to reiterate that following this webinar, you will receive a follow-up email with the slides from today and a link to the recording. They're also still available for download in the handouts tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. We also ask that you complete our evaluation following the webinar so that you can let us know your thoughts on today's session and really help us plan future webinars that are on topics important to you. So it looks like we did get another question in. They asked, is there a flow chart or worksheet that you could point to help identify risk?
That's a really good question. So I think it will change from one agency to another. Of course, there are some major risk categories that may apply to any agency, like risk of failure for different kinds of assets. But again, they can fail in multiple modes, like or different modes. Two of them mainly being structural versus functional. But this is the asset side, probability of assets to fail, or risks that can come from the assets. But we need to think about it from also a bigger perspective. That was actually a point that I was trying to emphasize in this presentation. So there are different ways in which we may be failing to deliver or to achieve our strategic goals, like not accounting for possible changes in regulations, or maybe not being aware of funding opportunities, which may, I guess it's not very realistic because everybody would be aware of those, I believe, but not being able to maybe communicate the problems the agency is facing with their management procedures to the general public. So if you have good transparent relations, of course the customers might be willing to pay more, right, in certain cases. So this might solve some of the funding problems potentially. So looking at it from a bigger perspective, I think will generate a better risk management approach. That's why it's important to have these workshops done on a periodic basis, and including stakeholders from within the agency. Depending on how big the agency is, we might have multiple units addressing different needs. So bringing them together along with maybe decision makers from other agencies or other units or other parts of a local government, maybe customer representatives from the customers base, putting them in a room and spending a whole day doing a risk workshop brainstorming might be really an informational process. So that was so to answer the question, I think there are some guidelines on when it comes to how risk should be managed, but many of them focus on managing risks coming from assets, like managing assets part of the asset management strategy. So I would recommend maybe thinking about it from a bigger perspective, and holding these workshops may be a good starting point.
Great, thank you so much for that answer. It looks like we are getting a couple more questions come in. So someone asked, what are your recommendations for handling the unknown unknowns?
Yeah, it is a difficult question because we are dealing with things that when we talk about unknown unknowns, what we're talking about is there are things that we don't know, and we don't know that we don't know those unknowns. So again, being prepared and having a plan B for different scenarios, thinking about what might be the worst case scenario and thinking about these, planning for these might be a good approach. Again, this comes at an expense, and you will be at least spending time, if not resources. So this might be hard to justify to other stakeholders, like when you have so many immediate needs and other risks that are apparent, that are visible to manage. Why do you spend so much time working on things that we can't really predict? Might be hard to justify. But I think one thing that we learned from this pandemic is importance of being prepared and having maybe a plan B, or having good procedures for crisis management. Looking for ways of improving the resiliency in our systems, not just asset by asset, but looking at the whole system and identifying weak points and what might result in a cascading catastrophic impact. Again, as part of our risk workshops, we may be thinking about these during these workshops. So scenario planning, improving resilience, those kind of approaches might be useful.
Great, thank you so much. It looks like there are a couple more questions. We probably won't get to all of them today, but we'll flag some of the unanswered ones for follow-ups. We may follow up to you personally to answer your questions. I guess I'm not sure if you have any answers to this off the top of your head, but we did have someone ask if you have any good examples of a facility, of a facility's risk management plan.
Oh, that's a great question. So I can maybe turn back with a more detailed answer for this one in a written manner. So I don't want to name names or, you know, insult some of the really good agencies that are doing outstanding work by forgetting to mention them. So I will try to look into this in more detail and maybe come back with a good answer. But there are many utilities, many agencies around the US and internationally that are doing fantastic jobs in managing risks.
All right, thank you so much. It looks like we are at 3 o'clock Eastern, and so that is the end of the session. Like I said, any unanswered questions, we'll try to follow up with you personally to make sure we answered anything that that got missed in this session. So I'd like to extend a big thanks to Berish for sharing his expertise with us today. I also want to reiterate that you will receive the slides from today and the recording. We also encourage you to take our evaluation and help us plan future webinars and things on things that you all care about. So thank you again, and we hope to see you at future EFCN events. So on that note, have a great day.
I also want to thank our audience, and I hope this was useful. Thanks, everyone.